Thank you for handling all this technology. It makes me scratch my head. One of my anxieties about this was dealing with almost 100 people on Zoom. I've been doing teaching and seminars for many years, but this whole Zoom business is brand new to me. So anyway, we've got about an hour and a half, and the topic is ethics, the larger topic, and the more focused topic is the issue of boundaries, how we encounter boundaries, boundary crossings, and boundary violations in our work. Let me tell you a little bit about myself, about how I ended up here. My wife and I moved to Vermont about 6 years ago, mainly to be near our granddaughters. Before I retired, I taught at the Marywood University School of Social Work for a good many years. I taught for 1 year at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. But my main qualification for dealing with the topic of ethics is that for years I was a member of, and for most of that time, the chair of the NASW Ethics Committee in Pennsylvania, at a time when the ethics review process was much more active than it is now. And I dealt with some very, very harrowing cases. And I've also studied ethics, and I've been practicing as an ethicist for a good many years. I've been retired for quite a while, and the only thing I still do is the occasional seminar and like this. And occasionally ethics consultations, people get in touch with me with particularly thorny issues, and I don't tell them what to do. I simply outline the competing issues and help them focus on what the issues are and what their discernment process might be. So today we're going to talk about this topic of boundaries, and there are two issues around boundaries. Number one, there are boundary crossings, and I guarantee that every one of us has encountered boundary crossings in our work and in our lives. We live in small towns, so we're all in rural New England here. We live in small towns. Those of you who have clinical practices, encounter your clients at the farmer's market or in a religious circumstance. Boundary crossings happen all the time. Our job is to manage them. Boundary violations are a whole other issue. Boundary violations are when your professional role gets compromised, when you have what's in essence a dual relationship with a person. I want to tell you about two boundary violations not particularly related to social work, just to get the concept down. One of them was a horrible situation in Pennsylvania. The other was a situation where I used to work when I first finished graduate school. There was a very famous criminal case in Pennsylvania. It's been known as Kids for Cash, where two judges in Northeast Pennsylvania received huge kickbacks. They were juvenile court judges. They received huge kickbacks from a juvenile detention center for sentencing kids to this particular detention center. And the sentencing was way out of proportion to what the kids did. You know, what the kids needed was maybe mediation or restorative justice or something like that. And these kids were incarcerated, and the judges got huge kickbacks. So that was a dual relationship, a huge boundary violation. On the one hand, they were judges making decisions. On the other hand, they were getting money for it. A far less egregious one happened in my first job after graduate school. This sounds very minor, but it was actually a pretty significant boundary violation. The director of the agency had a granddaughter. The granddaughter was selling Girl Scout cookies. And the director came around to all of us taking orders for the Girl Scout cookies. How many boxes do you want to buy? And what do you do when your boss comes around and says, well, you know, I'd really like you to buy 6 boxes of cookies? What's the unwritten statement there? If you don't buy them, I'm not going to be that nice to you as your boss. Those are two types of boundary violations. And there's many others that we're going to talk about today. If today all you come away with is a clear understanding of the difference between a boundary crossing and a boundary violation, that will be very helpful. But we're going to talk about more than that. Those two issues are really important. There are boundary crossings every single day. I encountered them. I lived in a small town in Pennsylvania, and I would encounter clients, corporate clients and personal clients routinely. My wife learned that when we were in the supermarket and somebody came up to me and started talking and I didn't introduce her to my wife, she would just move away and the client would talk away at me. I tried to discourage it, but it happened a lot. I want to take a little bit of time. I hope you'll indulge me. Just let me talk for a little while about ethics in general. What I'm going to try to do is compress a whole semester of Ethics 101 into about 15 or 20 minutes. I want to talk about ethics in general, then I want to talk about professional ethics and social work ethics. You are more than welcome. I really encourage you, if you have a question or a comment, type it up and Lynn will be able to, Lynn, are you there? Hope she's there.
I am.
Okay, if people type up a question, if you could act as sort of the moderator and pass the questions along with about 100 people here, I think we need that to moderate.
I'm keeping an eye on it.
Okay, and if you have a question, if you have a comment, please, by all means, put it in. I have an agenda for today. I've got my notes here, but in all the years I've been teaching and doing seminars, I have never followed those notes specifically, and I'm happy to move along to where you want to go. You know, I've had students over the years who proved to be much smarter than me, and sometimes their comments and their dissent were amazingly helpful. So don't hesitate for a second. If you have a question, if you have a comment, if you have a dissent, anything to add, type it up and Lynn will pass it along to the whole group and we'll deal with it. What I want to talk about here is, well, let me first stop. Anybody have any questions, any concerns right now before we move on? Maybe just shake your head or, okay. This is a whole new, brave new world doing programs like this. Let's talk about the nature and obligations of being a professional. Then I want to talk about professional ethics in general with reference to the NASW Code of Ethics. I want to talk about ethics problem solving and the nature of boundaries. And then, as Lynn mentioned earlier, we're going to give you a chance to break up into small groups. I sent you 4 case studies in the handouts. You're only going to have to look at 2 of them today, and they'll be in small groups. And the 2 questions that we're going to ask is, what are the ethical issues? What are the challenges? What are the competing values in these ethical dilemmas? And the second is the great question, what would you do? I need to tell you in advance, both of these case studies have gotten wildly divergent responses from people. That's why I chose them, because they are ambiguous, they're unclear. So, does that sound like a decent plan? Everybody okay with this? Okay, good. Thumbs up is a great thing to do. I really appreciate that. It helps me know where things are. But again, I really encourage you. If you have something you want to add, I would welcome it. I would encourage it. Just type it up for Lynn and she'll pass it along. Okay. You've got a handout.
I'm gonna,
yes.
Do we have an initial question about any input on social workers being active in the Black Lives Matter and other protests, as well as getting arrested during Black Lives Matter protests?
That's an interesting point.
So there's a softball question for you right off the bat.
Well, I would encourage you to honor your values and participate. The NASW Code of Ethics encourages social workers to work for social justice. I think it's a great, an important thing to do, both individually and collectively. It's certainly consistent with our Code of Ethics. No issues of boundary violations there. You know, the social work profession has changed in its 115, 120-year history. It was originally all about social justice. The clinical elements of it didn't come in until the 1920s, 1930s with the advent of the psychoanalytic movement. Social work went through quite an upheaval back in, I think, in the 1920s, when people say, you know, you're not a profession, you're just, you know, you're just welfare workers. And the advent of the clinical element of it was a big, big step forward. And in my mind, we've lost some of our fervor for social justice. And I would encourage you to be active in any way that your moral compass suggests. I hope that answers the question. I don't know what more to say about that. You got a handout, I believe, a brief guide to ethical professional practice. I'm going to be riffing off that, just talk about a few of the pieces. You can read the whole thing in detail later on. We need to begin with understanding what a professional is. A professional is somebody who is able to work, number one, in a self-directed way. That is, you don't need a direct supervisor. You should have enough knowledge and skill and a good enough moral compass that you can work in a self-directed way. That's what getting a license is all about. When you get a license, the state is saying, okay, you're able to figure stuff out for yourself. You don't need a supervisor. And it's altruistic. That is, you're working with the concerns and needs of your client in mind. And that means putting aside your own needs. That makes sense to people, I hope? Mm-hmm. That's the ultimate definition of a professional. All the major professions have codes of ethics, and they're all remarkably similar. I once found a code of ethics written for English land surveyors that was so similar to the NASW code of ethics that all I had to do, if I'd wanted to, was change a few words in the search and replace thing in Word. I would have had something just like the NASW code of ethics. They're remarkably similar because they all direct you to be competent in your field with your skills and work with the needs and wants of your client as the primary and really only goal. When we have a boundary violation, what's happening is that we're injecting our own needs and our own desires and our own sensibilities into it, sometimes at the expense of the client. The NASW Code of Ethics, big, long document. I fall asleep reading it, and I've actually had to read the whole thing, and it's hard to stay awake. But what you need to know about it is that most of it, almost all of it, is aspirational. What I mean by aspirational is that it leaves you with the job of figuring out what you're going to do in any difficult situation. It doesn't tell you, it's not like you can't go to the back of the book and find the answers, like you used to be able to do in math class. There are two elements of the code where there is no wiggle room. Number one, obviously, no romantic or sexual relationship with current clients. It's interesting that that varies state by state. Everybody has different guidelines about that. The other one that is a no-no is no kickbacks, no fee splitting. Everybody understand what fee splitting is? I see lots of nods. Essentially, if a doctor's going to refer somebody to you and the doctor says, I'll send you this person for counseling, but you have to kick back 20% of the fee. That's a no-nonsense violation of the Code of Ethics. Everything else is aspirational. It gives you general guidelines, but does not specifically tell you what to do. It would be great if it did. And when people call me for ethics consultations, sometimes they've gotten a little frustrated because I wouldn't tell them what to do. I would help them lay out the issues. One of the handouts I gave you, I sent you one that has just a very brief, my summary of the Code of Ethics. I think you have it just outlining a few items that are in the Code of Ethics that define ethical behavior. You should have it in one of your handouts. The code goes on for pages and pages. I'm not going to read the whole thing now, but it's there for you. So, when we deal with ethical problems, they're never easy. If they were easy, there wouldn't be an ethical problem. Haven't you all, at one time or another, sat up in the middle of the night thinking, what do I do in this situation? Mm-hmm. I see a lot of you nodding with that. Yeah. I don't know what to do. That's an ethical dilemma. And if you are struggling with that, well, welcome to the club. And I would further add that if you're struggling with that, that suggests to me that you are acting and following your profession ethically. The people who scare me, and I've encountered a number of them in my programs, people who scare me say, I never have any problems. I always know what to do. I never have to think about it. Those people are scary. It takes some ethical discernment. I usually spend, when I was teaching, I would spend 3 or 4 or 5 classes outlining an ethics problem-solving algorithm. And you can find this in the social work literature. Those of you who are in school are probably encountering it now, and those of you who were in school might remember it. Essentially, without taking too much time, what it's about is depersonalizing the issue and identifying the competing values. There's a phrase to remember from today. What are the competing values? And why do I say depersonalize it? Because when we can do that, we can get our emotions out of it. You know, if you have a client you really can't stand, that can get in the way of a clear, objective, ethical discernment issue. Something that's really important to do, I believe, is once you've, or as you're defining the values, to get other people involved. It's always dangerous to do an ethics discernment all by yourself. People have called me for one simple reason. They want another voice. So if things really go bad for them, they can actually say, hey, you know, I sought consultation. I talked to Jacob, and that's going to help if there's a lawsuit or an ethics complaint. Don't do it alone. Identify the values, depersonalize it, get some consultation, get some other people involved. Many agencies, virtually all hospitals, have ethics committees. Some of them are freestanding and stay in operation all the time and do proactive training. Others convene when there's a messy situation. If you have an opportunity for using an ethics committee, it's really worthwhile to do it. If you're in private practice, solo practice, it's great to use if you have a peer supervision group or group within your practice or your agency. It's great to use that to deal with ethics issues. I'm not going to bore you with all the stuff that's in the social work literature because you'll have no trouble finding it. The most famous one is what's called the Ethical Principles Screen by, my memory, Dolgoff, Lowenstein. I think you'll have no trouble finding it in the social work literature. Another piece that often gets lost in ethics discernment is that we are, I'll talk about myself. From time to time, I've been cowardly about defining my own personal interests in a situation. We need to be courageous. What is the interest of my agency, my practice in this? I've dealt with situations with school districts where they were really pushing hard to not have to pay for a student's special education, when it was really clear that the clinical and ethical issues suggested that they needed to do it. And they would argue against that because they didn't want to spend the money. And it's important for us to identify those personal interests in it. And once you've made an ethical decision, once you've decided what you got to do, live with it and defend it. Even if it's wrong, you know, you've done due diligence here. That's a really important concept. When you just toss out an ethics decision, you're in some danger. I should also mention really quickly that we're talking about ethics today. We're not talking about risk management. There's a big difference. The old phrase that I've always liked is that risk management is about doing things right. Ethics is about doing the right thing. And that's what we're going to be talking about as we talk about boundaries. You know, ethics is one of the branches of formal philosophy. And when you're doing an ethics discernment, you are practicing philosophy. You are doing philosophy, as they say in philosophy departments. You may not be using the formal language of philosophy, but you are putting certain values into the situation. I want to recommend a book if any of you are interested in it. This is an old book. I don't know if you can read, it's reversed here, I guess. The Philosophical Foundations of Social Work by Frederick Weimer. It's been around for a good many years. And he relates what we do every day in our agencies and practices to the works of Socrates and Immanuel Kant and John Stuart Mill. And it's also an eminently readable book. I did not know about this book when I was teaching. I wish I did. I would have made all my students read it. The Philosophical Foundations of Social Work by Frederick Weimer. So that's what I just did, was a whole semester about ethics discernment. And when I was teaching, what I would do is take that and expand it, quite a bit longer. And then we would spend most of the semester dealing with case studies. What would we do in this situation? What would we do in that situation? And students would bring situations from their field placements and we would chew on them. And what I was trying to do was help the students articulate their own personal value system and see how that connected with the NASW value system. The NASW value system is a very progressive code of ethics. We can see very clearly the principles of the European Enlightenment and the progressive movement of the early years of the 20th century. So there you have a real quick summary of Ethics 101. Those of you who are students, I understand there's a lot of students with us today. This hopefully will sound familiar to you. If it doesn't, you'll be getting to it sometime soon. So, let me stop and see if there are any questions. Lynn, has anybody got any comments, questions, concerns? I don't know. Lynn, are you there?
I am here. There's nothing in the chat for questions, but if people wanted to take themselves off of mute, maybe they could do that. They could ask a question now.
Okay, does anybody have anything they would like to add or ask or challenge? Okay, very good. Okay, let's move on then. Let's see, where were we? 9:30. Okay. At about 9:45 or 10 of 10, thereabouts, Lynn will break you up into small groups. Let's talk about boundaries for a little bit. When we have a work situation, whether it's an agency, a private practice, a clinic, a hospital, invariably we're going to have relationships with clients that are, wait a minute, got a comment here. I thought the comment about making a decision and sticking with it was interesting. Can whoever's put that comment in unmute and fill us in? I lost the comment, I'm afraid.
The question is, I thought the comment about making a decision and sticking with it was interesting. I would think if it's wrong, you could revisit it and think about whether to do something differently.
Well, yeah. Oh, yeah. If you find out that it's wrong, of course you want to rethink it. But if you've worked hard to come up with a solution, with an approach, all I'm suggesting you do is own that. Not necessarily defend it if you find that it doesn't need to be defended, but own it. Say, this is, and own the process. When there are ethics complaints, it serves you a whole lot better if you can document that you did a very, very thorough ethics discernment process. I was involved in an ugly situation many years ago, and I called some colleagues and I told them the situation because I was pretty sure I was in good shape, but I wanted to be able to document that I had spoken with others, that I hadn't just dreamt this up out of my own strange mind. So, anybody else? Somebody said they had muted and now perhaps are unmuted. Who wanted to say something? Oh, this is some of the downfalls of this sort of technology. But boundary violations and boundary crossings, let's take a little bit of time to talk about them. If we live in small towns, if we go to a church, if we go shopping at a supermarket, we are bound to encounter our clients, and we have lots of opportunities where dual relationships become inevitable. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's quite possible that it won't impact on your work. Because boundary crossings simply mean that you're both living in a community, you're interacting with each other. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but they require management. They require management so that it doesn't turn into a boundary violation. In my religious life, and I bet some of you have had the same issue, I used to have clients who would come to the same place I was worshiping. That made me extremely uncomfortable. I didn't like it at all, but they had as much right to be there as I did. That was not necessarily an issue. I had to manage that, and my way of managing it was to talk to them privately. And these were either current clients or former clients. And I would talk to them privately and explain that, you know, in the context of our religious life, I was not going to ever acknowledge their past connection with me. And I would ask them to do the same. I was frequently offered, people would come to me and want to hire me to do counseling from my, for Quaker meeting. From my meeting, you know, Quakers are a quirky bunch. We have our own way of thinking and talking. And they would want a Quaker counselor, but it wouldn't be me, because that would have been a dual relationship. Whether or not it would be a boundary violation, that's another issue, but it certainly would have been a dual relationship. Let me ask, have others of you encountered that sort of dual relationship? Anybody want to unmute and talk? What kind of situations you've encountered?
Can I talk? My name is Emily. I'm
Go
trying
ahead,
to,
please.
yeah, I'm trying to enlarge my screen. Sorry, so I can at least, anyway, I'm a member of Al-Anon, and I refer a lot of clients to Al-Anon, and one of them goes to a meeting, started going to a meeting that I would like, actually she was there first, and I would like to go to that meeting. And I've only gone once or twice, and I really worry about whatever I have to share about, whatever I share about, I don't want her to bring it into therapy room. And whatever I would share about, I worry about how it will affect her, and I know that it doesn't belong in the therapy room. So for the most part, I think it's best for me not to share at that meeting. She's already said she doesn't mind at all if I go, but I don't think sharing, I think sharing compromises a therapy relationship. But I do wonder what your thoughts are.
Do others want to respond? I have my thoughts about that, but I'd be really interested in what others have to say. I appreciate you telling us that, Emily. That's an interesting issue. Others have something they want to add about that? And respond to Emily? Should she go to this meeting?
Well, not should I go, but well, should I go, and if I go, should I share?
Mm-hmm. Would you want to go to a meeting where you couldn't share?
Yes.
Okay.
Because I learn a lot. I learn more by listening than talking.
Okay.
Emily, are there other meetings that are open to you where you would feel more open about sharing in those meetings?
There are not a lot of meetings in the state. So there are, you know, it's a question of, this is one of the most convenient and also enriching meetings.
Oh, I should have announced, this is Kate Fox. I resonate with what you're saying. My personal inclination would be to do as you are and not, you know, and to you put it so beautifully, to listen, you know, because you're getting so much. I do think it's hard to ask a client to be able to separate, you know, that information. That's just my opinion based upon my experience.
I had a question.
How would it impact your clients? Oh, sorry, your clients' participation in the group, if it would make them less inclined to want to share. I feel like there's also that dynamic that might be at play that you might want to think about more, how your present might change how they present in the group.
Mm-hmm. Right. And she has said that she doesn't mind it at all, but who knows how it could actually play out. It could turn out to be hard for her. You're right. I mean, yes, it's a good point.
Others, I heard a male voice.
Yeah, that was me. I'm Brent Coleman, student at a university in New Hampshire, getting my MSW. And I think you can answer my question. My question was, how does the client feel about you going? And I think it was Heather that mentioned that the dynamic or the relationship that you have with the client could change. And I think it could go one way or the other. It could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. And I think that that decision between you and the client is really weighing those risks and discussing that before you attend. But in my opinion, and no judgment at all, but I would not attend just because I feel it would really risk the relationship with the client. And if it does go south, it could really affect that client in a negative way.
You bring up, all of you bring up an important element of this issue of boundary crossings and boundary violations, and that is the limits and boundaries of self-disclosure. I actually did a program in Montpelier just on the topic of self-disclosure. How much do we want our clients to know about us? What's good and not good about them knowing more or less about us? That is a boundary issue. And that's what I think, Emily, that's what you're encountering there. What levels of self-disclosure are each of you interested in? On the one hand, she might learn something, he or she might learn something about you. On the other hand, you might learn something about the clients that could impinge on your relationship. Everybody has different levels of self-disclosure, and it matters according to a lot of contexts. Classical psychoanalysts, they didn't want their clients to know anything about them. Woody Allen joked that his psychoanalyst died, and he didn't realize it for 2 years. He just kept coming into the office and sat there. Other people, including me, are much more comfortable about self-disclosure. But again, it's context sensitive. It depends on the situation, depends on the client. But what you're talking about here has to do with the boundaries of self-disclosure. And one of the case studies that you'll be looking at in a little while has to do with Facebook and lurking on Facebook and how much disclosure you get from clients there. And one of the other case studies is about the social worker using Facebook. There are 4 case studies. We're only going to look at 2 of them today because we just don't have enough time. What we're talking about here are boundary crossings that can spill over into boundary violations. All of you know about the gross boundary violations. Don't have sex with your clients, don't have romantic involvements, don't have business involvements with them. That's been a tricky business. Sometimes I know of a psychologist actually in my town in Pennsylvania who hired one of his clients to be his bookkeeper. And the bookkeeper, of course, had all the names of all the other clients. Those are the gross boundary violations. And how do you figure out what's the difference between a crossing and a violation? Anybody want to take a shot at that? When does a crossing spill over into being a violation?
Intention and power imbalance.
Power imbalance, that's the key, yeah. What are you doing that's going to benefit you other than, you know, your prearranged fee? Is there something in it for you? Are you putting your own needs up sometimes as more important than the client's needs? I was aware of a case in Pennsylvania years ago that just infuriated me. This was a male social worker in private practice who began a sexual relationship with one of his clients. And in the various hearings about it, he claimed that he was doing it for the good of the client. He felt that she needed, whatever, I won't go into all the ugly details about it, but he felt that it was going to be beneficial to her and helpful in the therapy. Well, that was nonsense. That was just plain nonsense, and the whole concept was rejected. But it was a gross case of his finding that putting his needs as more important, his desires as more important than the client. And that to me is the heart of it. When you stop, what is my role here? What is my benefit? Am I going beyond that altruistic requirement of being a professional? And sometimes it's not as easy as you might think to discern that. Sometimes people just want to exert more power over a client or over an employee, and they're pushing very hard to participate in a relationship that's just not a pure professional relationship. If you have a pen, pencil and pen, write down something that you can look up later. Back in the 80s and 90s in Pennsylvania, there was a horrendous case. Look up Genesis Associates, Exton, Pennsylvania. Now, there's a lot of businesses called Genesis Associates. You want to find the practice that was in Exton, Pennsylvania, E-X-T-O-N. I am not violating anything private here. This made the newspapers, it was in the courts. This was a psychologist and a social worker who did all kinds of horrendous things, taking money from their clients, interfering with the clients' family relationships, hiring their clients to be therapists. It's a fascinating case to read. You won't have to go too far looking for it on the internet. It's quite a famous case. But it's where the counselors thought about their needs as more important than that of the clients. They were sued, they lost their licenses. It was just a very ugly case. But that's the key issue with boundary violations. What's in it for you? And if you stop and ask that question, and sometimes even get consultation, you know, I'm thinking of doing this or that, but I'm wondering if I'm sticking my own needs into it in some way or another. I had a situation years ago that I actually consider this to have been a potential boundary violation. And I've gotten a lot of heat for this. I've talked to my colleagues, and not everybody agrees that I did the right thing. I had a client come see me the first time. And this is hard to say. I just plain couldn't stand her. I just found her one of the most loathsome people I've ever met in my life. And by all accounts, I should have been able to help her. I should have been able to treat her. I told her I wasn't qualified to help her. What was really in my mind was just my personal need to not deal with this horrible person. I've struggled with this for years. I consider that I violated a boundary there. I think I did it for appropriate reasons. I don't think I could have served her well, but it's troubled me ever since. And we see romantic relationships, financial relationships, social relationships. There was a therapist, a social worker in Pennsylvania, who felt that taking his clients out dancing was therapeutic. And that actually engendered quite a bit of controversy among people I've spoken with. Any thoughts about that? Could that ever be considered an ethical thing? Anybody?
I guess it would depend on the environment of which they were dancing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is the clinician dancing with the clients? What type of dancing is it? But I think active counseling could be helpful. I know I work with adolescents, so walking around the track,
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of a form of dancing, but we're actively doing something.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it depends on the dynamic.
The context.
But yeah, everything kind of put together. That's a complicated question.
It is very complicated. Now, if it was just one therapist and one client going romantic dancing, that's one thing, as opposed to maybe taking a group of people square dancing or contra dancing. It's a very tricky issue. And it has to do with the context of it, who's there. That particular discussion engendered a lot of argument and disagreement. My sense is that it was a little bit risky. Not everybody agreed with me. There's another place where boundary issues, when somebody just made a comment. The book, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, the therapist dances with the client in their last session, I guess. That brings up an interesting point. Physical contact, hugging, that sort of thing. I've always maintained a very, very firm policy. No hugging, no physical contact. And I've been absolutely relentless about that for years. Now, a colleague of mine, in fact, more than a colleague, she was my mentor in many ways, one of the social workers I most respect in the world, teaching colleague of mine, felt differently and does feel differently about it. And she would frequently hug clients and students. I would never do that. For me, it was too risky. I perceived that to be a boundary violation. She didn't. And I could argue that it's context sensitive, that depends on who it is, genders, relationship, that sort of thing. But again, that's an issue where some careful discernment is worthwhile. I've decided in my discernment that I'm just not going to do it, partially because I'm a male and it's riskier. But that's an issue where a boundary crossing, a hugging can be a perfectly acceptable boundary crossing. In the wrong context, it could be, or if taken wrong, it could be seen as a violation. So I opted for years to just not get into hugging. I've made occasional exceptions. A final session when the client wasn't coming back after a long period of work, that sort of thing, but very carefully controlled.
Hey, Jacob, this is Lynn, and I'm just, as my role in the background here, timekeeper, because we're just a little bit past 9:45, 9:48. Yeah. Would you like to break into the rooms right now, or?
Yeah, but let's just ask if anybody has anything they would want to add before we do that. Any other questions or comments? I see Samantha raise her hand.
Yeah, I have a question about the boundary thing. So what if it benefits the client and that's your goal, but it also benefits you in some way? And I'll give an example. I live in a small town. My line of work puts me at an inpatient level of care. I have been working with the kiddo, and in my area, there are no available clinicians independently. The parent went out, found that I was independent. I've worked with this kiddo several times. We have a really good relationship, and I'm able to really reach this kiddo. And my original job told me that is a violation because I could have a dual role. So I was kind of interested in what the thought was there.
Oh, what a perfect case about having to do a careful ethics discernment process. You bring up the issue of what happens in small towns and rural areas. Let me just take a shot at it. Again, I'm just winging it here. Given that sort of context, and if there were full disclosure, to everybody about what was going on, you might be able to justify that as an ethically appropriate action. I'm not sure, but there are circumstances that could play into that. And that's exactly what I mean when I say we have to struggle with ethical decisions, and there's no absolute. In another context, it would be absolutely clear that that was an ethical violation, but maybe not here. It depends on the context. I lived in Alaska for a year, and I had a lot of contact with social workers in Alaska, especially social workers who worked with the native tribes, who were natives. Whole different set of boundary violations, boundary crossings there. Every day there were boundary crossings. These were people who lived in small native villages. The social worker might be the only mental health professional around for hundreds and hundreds of miles, and things that would never be considered acceptable in Philadelphia or Montpelier or Maine were routine there. Just a real quick example. I know we want to get into our small groups. I was doing an ethics program at the local hospital in Fairbanks, and with some native social workers. And one of them was talking about what happens when somebody dies in a hospital. And she posed the question to the group, if you work in a hospital and somebody dies, what do you do? And most of the social workers said, well, we contact the next of kin, the spouse or whoever. Well, the native social worker said, that would be a terrible thing to do. That would be a horrible boundary violation here. What you do is you contact the village elder first. The village elder will put together a committee, a group of people who go to the house of the next of kin. And I remember that moment as just a real enlightenment for me about how ethics guidelines are so variable depending on culture and context. And these were very experienced social workers, and they were applying native culture, Athabascan culture primarily, to the NASW Code of Ethics. And what they came up with within the context of that culture made perfect sense. But in your situation, Samantha, I think there are a lot of variables there that might mitigate might make it a little less extreme that it's an ethics violation. You know, there's a whole world of study about rural social work, about how different things can be in rural contexts from urban contexts. But that's certainly worth a careful discernment process. And if you're going to do something that may appear to be a violation, if you get full agreement for everybody who's involved, that may take away some of the discomfort about it. You say, you know, I know this is not something that we normally do, but given this context, given our little town and given all this and that and the other thing, here's what I want to do. Is that okay with you? You know, when social workers leave agencies, they're not supposed to take their clients with them. That's an ethics violation. But very often, an agency will say, yeah, it's okay, you can do it for various reasons because there's nobody else, or whatever the reason might be. And that takes away the pain. Then it's not a problem. What you've done is explain it all to everybody and just go public about it, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Other questions? We do want to get to the small groups. I saw somebody else.
I have a quick question. Yep. Hi, I'm Christina. Hi. So I had posted earlier just something that I'm curious to get your thoughts on. So I work for one of our designated agencies in the state of Vermont. I'm one of the directors, and I have a lot of staff underneath me. And separate from my social work job, I actually run 2 small businesses from home, one of which is a jewelry party, and I do live parties on Facebook. And some of my staff have actually found me while I'm doing these live parties and have purchased jewelry. And there's an element of me that's like, well, this is kind of uncomfortable because they're staff, they work for me, but they're also joining in on their own. And I guess the example I had talked to my husband about is, you know, if I had a booth set up at the farmer's market and they came to that booth, I wouldn't tell them they can't buy anything because they work for me. So it's just a little peculiar that this is now happening where I have some of my staff who are curious about this and they want to join in. So because I'm their boss in the social work world, I'm curious what your thoughts are on this.
I can't imagine you saying, well, you're a client, I won't sell you jewelry. That's a tricky area. I guess the issue is, I'm just, again, thinking at a dead run. The issue is who is pushing to buy it. If they come to you and you're clear that, hey, you know, I sell jewelry, but I don't want this, this has nothing to do with our work relationships at all. In my estimation, that would not necessarily be problematic. Others might feel differently. If you were to go to your subordinates and say, hey, I'm selling jewelry, if you go around to their desks and say, I'm selling jewelry, how much do you want to buy? That would be terrible. But I don't think you're doing that.
Perfect. And that's the thing. I never talk about what I do at work with my staff, but if they find me online, that's what felt different.
I'm just thinking, I'd be interested in what others think, but from my perspective, I would probably say something on, you know, I'm happy to sell you the jewelry, but you know, this has nothing to do with work. This is completely separate. Others might feel differently about it. Anybody want to weigh in before we go to the small groups? Okay, listen, I really appreciate you have brought up some wonderful cases about the slippery, difficult area, the boundary between boundary crossings and boundary violations. So you've got 2 cases, and Lynn, I know, is ready to break you up into small groups. The 2 cases I've chosen here, and you have a list of questions, 2 questions to look at. What are the values and issues in competition, and what would you do? Both of these cases I chose because they have been the source of all kinds of arguments in my classes and my ethics seminars. I've had people argue fiercely on both sides of this. One of them, I had two very senior faculty members almost come to blows over one of the issues. I stood back there watching it, but my goodness, these are university professors. It was quite a sight. So Lynn's going to break you up into small groups. When we get back, we're obviously not going to have time for all 20 or so groups to process, but we'll see what we can do about this. I'm encountering some of the limitations of a large group online here, and I think we're doing the best we can here, but there are some limitations. Normally when I do ethics, yeah.
No, I think people should consider this like if we were in a live in-person workshop, you'd all be at tables and you'd be given hypotheticals to discuss and argue over.
Okay, yes, exactly right, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to let Lynn do this now. And let's see, it's now 9:57. Let's get back at 10:15.
Right, you're going to be broken into rooms. It'll automatically pull you back. At the end, it will give you a 60-second warning that you're about to be sucked out of your groups and put back into the big group. So here you go. Enjoy.
Okay. Well, friends, I think we're back. Can you folks hear me? Let me give you my video. There. I see in the picture I had up, I was wearing one of my Hawaiian shirts. I should have probably worn that today too. But if you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Good, okay. Well, I lurked on one of the groups as we discussed something about lurking. There's a bunch of groups, probably 15 or 20 groups. I don't know how we're possibly going to get to them in the next 19 minutes, but would anybody care to, let's talk about the first case study. The social worker lurking on social media. What's the issue there? What are the boundary violations there, if any?
So I don't mind sharing. So I actually brought up to my group that before the pandemic, like using Zoom and Skype was actually not considered a confidential resource. And so only because of the pandemic has the state of Maine, where I am right now, temporarily allowed us to use that platform. So I'm thinking if Zoom and Skype are not considered confidential resources, then certainly going on Facebook and using it to, you know, under kind of false pretenses to obtain information or just even lurk and then accidentally come across information is for sure at least a crossing, if not a violation. And that, you know, the client has a right to be autonomous. Like they can come in and lie through their teeth to us. It's not really like they owe us much in that regard. And that kind of in that sense of things. You know, we're there to provide a service. They're not there to provide us a service. So I would think that, right, it was inappropriate, but how to follow up on it was hard. One of my group members had a great response and how she would follow up with it, but I don't want to, if she wants to share it, I'll let her share.
Somebody want to share?
Sure. One of the things that I talked about was maybe bringing it up in session and then, you know, talking with them about whether or not that's something that is, you know, breaking the trust in the therapeutic relationship, and then helping them to find another therapist if that's the case, you know, or if they choose to continue working through what that might look like.
Okay, so you would bring it up. You would acknowledge that that it happened.
One of
Yeah.
our groups talked about the importance of supervision from the agency, how to deal both with that and with the potential that the social worker observed or may have interpreted in financial resources, because the agency was the one that set the sliding fee, not the local social, not the individual social worker.
In our group, we talked about that as well, that you've got two different issues. The one about how you found the information by looking on Facebook. But now that you've got the information, if you're working in an agency where they use a sliding fee scale, that you may want to suggest to this individual that they're going to meet with someone else in the agency as part of a redetermination of eligibility for sliding fee scale, because there are other clients you have obligations to and the money only goes so far. And if she can now afford, because her circumstance has changed, to pay more, you need to do that so that you can serve your other clients who may really be lower income.
Rick, I appreciate you bringing that up. You identify issues of distributive justice there.
Could I?
It's important. Could I offer?
Can I say something? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was kicked out of the breakout room, so I didn't get a chance to discuss. My internet cut out. But so isn't it in the code of ethics? I'm in school and I'm pretty sure it was in the code of ethics that we're not supposed to look up our clients on Facebook. And also whatever think about Facebook and the fact that nobody puts their sad things on there. Well, some people do. We all put our positive, happy things. So whatever she is portraying out there to the world might be what she wants them to see, her picture perfect life. You don't know where the vehicle came from. Invisalign, you can make payments.
I think that's a really good point, and we talked about that as a group. The thing that didn't feel good for any of us was, and I hadn't realized it was now in the code of ethics, which is great to hear, but I don't do that. I know people do it, but the lurking thing just didn't feel right. to any of us. Yet we realize that there's, for child welfare and stuff, where there's certain Facebook pages where they have to do that, or you have to communicate in certain settings. But the clients know that. And I do appreciate that Charlandry illusionist point about Facebook.
Yeah, in the code of ethics, it's standard 2.10.
I also think it's important to think about what impact is there on the therapeutic relationship for your client to discover that you are following them or looking for them.
We're invading their privacy by looking at
I think another issue in the therapeutic relationship that would need to go to the agency supervision is that the lurking is happening.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was described as lurking, not as part of a child welfare monitoring protocol. And so what the heck is that therapeutic relationship really like? Deserves some examination.
We also agreed it should be a group peer individual supervision issue for sure.
I would also suggest that it's a practice or agency policy issue that should be articulated in whatever contract you put together with a client, where you are asserting that you will not go seeking them out on social media, and you hope they won't do it to you. And if you have a social media page, as many of us do, you might want to think about what's on there. What do I want my clients to know about me? What don't I want them to know? One colleague of mine has 2 Facebook pages. One that she doesn't mind anybody seeing, and another one for her friends and more personal things. She has 2 slightly different names and keeps it that way. And there are privacy levels that you can put in Facebook. But to me, the ethical issue is that you really are intruding into a person's life if you proactively seek that out. I was talking about a recovering alcoholic I was working with years ago. I saw him stumble out of a bar one day as I was driving through town. That wasn't information I sought, but it was information I got through, I think, very legitimate means. And I did confront him about it. Look at the clinical perspective on this too. There's also a clinical perspective. If you were working with this person and you knew that he or she had just told you a pack of lies, how would that impact on your relationship with that person? How would you feel about it? Sitting there thinking, I'm not sure this person's being truthful with me. I'm not sure this person is disclosing. It would damage your clinical relationship, I believe. Do others think so also? Okay.
I work for a drug court though, so it's par for the course.
Say again, please.
I work for a drug court. I'm a clinician for a drug court. And so it is par for the course that clients obfuscate or try to color what they share with me because they don't want to go to prison.
Sure. Yeah.
Sure. That reminds me of something I faced for many years. I was the director of social services at public housing. If I went into someone's house and they had, who I've come to know, a drug dealer living there, what do I do as a social worker for that public housing? I was faced with that dilemma for many years. Other cases of, things that they were hiding.
These are difficult decisions. They don't come easily. But I think as a rule of thumb, I would suggest that in this world of all this social media, proactive lurking may be ethically problematic. Now, there are child welfare cases, few other situations where it might be perfectly appropriate. But again, that should be in a context of disclosure, that it's been articulated and agreed to, that part of the relationship involves poking around in your social media. That would be a rare situation.
There should also be policies and procedures around all of the social media use within your agency that you should be well aware of.
Absolutely, I agree, yeah. We're talking about preventing ethical problems. Number one, by individuals just agreeing not to go lurking. And number two, for there to be agency policies and practices. And number three, for there to be a clear statement about all of this in whatever intake contracts you do with clients. And I hope you're all doing intake contracts with clients. It protects you. Have them clear, articulated, and make sure the client understands them. It's one of the biggest failings I encountered years ago, poking around various agencies and things like that, that they would not articulate, not spell out the counseling relationship. And it's an important piece to have that clearly laid out. And in dealing with social media, that's a part that can be a part of those contracts. Okay, we've only got a few more minutes left. I would like to touch base on the other case, because this is a fascinating one. I have had colleagues argue fiercely about this case. What do you say about the person who wants to start a relationship with the mother of a client? Is that a boundary violation? Certainly a boundary crossing. I don't think we need to argue about that. Is it problematic in any way?
I think marriage and family therapy, at least in the past, has said no to even future within 3-5 years from having worked with clients for any intimate relationship.
Okay, so you're saying the time frame there is completely inappropriate?
And
just the time frame?
Well, it's also, I know that, I think, like, I'm sure like the counter argument could be that, like, it's not like the mother is the direct client, like it's the child that was a direct client, and this is just happens, you know, to be the mother that this person is attracted to. So I can see maybe their counter argument there, but for me, I just would think it's just inappropriate. Like, you know, they might not have met otherwise. And I know that there's in the NASW, I thought there was like a 5-year, like I think you had to wait 5 years if you were to pursue.
It varies it varies from state to state, and there's no clear, absolute, definitive guideline about that.
Certainly a conflict of interest.
Yeah, yeah.
Right, at the very least.
Yeah, somebody put a message, I would feel it's never okay to date a former client and even a family member. Some people are saying absolutely never. Let me pose an annoying question. Can you configure a scenario where this would be ethically okay?
I think another piece that was, I felt was not good was the power dynamic. It was that the trainer kind of reached out to the client. And so I felt like that was an unfair power dynamic. Had it been not that way and maybe appropriate amount of time passed aside and the client kind of initiated, that would feel better in some ways because it wasn't like being forced upon them, or there wasn't that kind of perceived dynamic.
If the client had initiated, it might have been better. Let's talk about time frame. How about if 5 years had gone by? And how about if the clinician and the mother happened to meet each other in church or at a party a couple of years later? Are there scenarios where this would be okay?
Well, 5 years go by. If this is a teenager, I would imagine that the teenager is no longer a minor and is an adult in the eyes of the law. So that might be just different circumstances at that point.
So there
you want
might
to
be
really have fun
circumstances.
with this kind of discussion. You want to take it up with some of your colleagues who work in other parts of the country. In my travels, I found that this kind of discussion varies very greatly from one part of the country to another.
I agree with you. I was just about to bring up Alaska. Talk more about that if you would, Rick.
I did some work in Alaska a number of years ago, and there are partner shortages. So people in a lot of different professions have different ways of forming relationships after much shorter periods of time that they feel are okay in Alaska than they do in a lot of other places. I worked for a while on a special project in Texas. And in the cities in Texas, it's pretty much the same way we look at it. But when you get out into the really rural areas, very different way of thinking about things when it comes to relationships. So if you just want to have some interesting discussions with colleagues, discuss this with people from other parts of the country.
You beat me to the punch. I was just about to talk about Alaska when you did it, and I appreciate what you said. So the issues of time the issues of culture and context might impact on this. And when I've presented this case before, it's led to some pretty fierce arguments. Some people said, you know, given the right context, given the right passage of time, given the right self-disclosure, this might be an entirely ethical action. Others, especially in the cities, feel fiercely that it can never be appropriate. A lot of older mental health professionals have a firm policy that they never, ever, ever have any kind of social relationships, romantic or social, with clients for the rest of their lives. Again, it's context sensitive. So I see. Any other comments about this? We're running out.
One other one. We tend to have these discussions usually thinking with our clinical hats on. But when some of us do organizing and community work, you have different relationships with clients that are non-therapeutic, where you do find yourself very often as part of that organizing work or community work in social situations. And you all have to have that discussion, that you're not going to have a romantic relationship, but it certainly is okay after a big victory on a social justice project to have a community celebration where you're all there enjoying each other's company and having fun. It's very different.
Well, this was exactly what I was hoping to do. If I had presented a real simple situation of a social worker having sex with a client, you all would have said, no, 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 no. And I wouldn't have had anything else to talk about for the remainder of the time. Both of these cases have engendered all sorts of ferment and arguments when I've done programs, just as we did it here. And then I've just been, a pain in the neck throwing in different situations to make it more complicated. What if this was a rural native village in Alaska? What if 5 years had gone by? What if the teenager was now 25 years old and completely separate from the agency? The point is that these issues take discernment. If there's a single message I want to get across today, it's think about the issues in their larger context, define the specific values that are in competition with each other, and you'll always find two values clashing with each other. Somebody just put a note, something about wondering about the teenager, how this would have affected the teenager. A very important factor in this. And that could be a very good reason to say, no, 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 not after 3 months. Too close, because the kid is still there and the kid could be affected by this. But when the kid gets to be 25 or 30, could be perfectly appropriate. My point is that these things are not easy. The easy ethical dilemmas are not dilemmas. They're just our clinical, our discernment. It's when we sit up in the middle of the night and think, what am I going to do in this situation? That's the stuff that I like to talk about. When you move ahead on something and you just have this nagging doubt that haunts you, that's why we need this, some sort of algorithm, some sort of approach to it. And in that one handout, I think I gave you a number of ideas about that. There's another resource you might want to look at. NASW for years has published a book called The Ethics Audit that is good for agencies, good for group practices. Just take a look at what your ethical procedures are, how you can piece them together. Well, I see 10:30, and I promise Lynn and I promised it would go till 10:30. Does anybody have any final words of wisdom or thoughts or anything more they want to say? Well, listen,
I'm actually going to break, and maybe we can stay, if people do want to stay on for a few minutes, we can have people stay on for a few minutes, but I do want to wrap up the logisticals because I know people do have clients and things that they need to move on to. Again, thank you for coming. If you are here for CEUs, please make sure that your full name is typed into the chat. This workshop has been recorded, so it should be up on the NASW Vermont website, which we are currently in the process of updating. Probably give us a week to do that. You will be receiving the evaluation soon. Please make sure you send it to Barbara, not to me, and she will get you your certificate once you return your evaluation. I'll also say Barbara's in the office Tuesdays and Wednesdays. So if you don't get it today, Tuesday or Wednesday of next week, you'll be sure to get it. So thank you all for coming.
Properly on the email so that we know how to reach Barbara?
Oh yes, everything that you need to know will be in the email, and I'll be sending that out in a couple minutes.
Can I just say one more thing? Also, you've got a lot of handouts and some other case studies that we didn't talk about today. Please feel free to use those with your colleagues, pass them around, chew on the case studies with others if you like. I do ask that you leave my name attached to them. I once had somebody steal my handouts and do his own programs. But other than that, feel free to copy them and use them if they can be of any help at all.
Thank you.
And I'll hang around here if
Thank
people
you
want to
all
stay.
very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Feel free to click yourself out or stay on for a few minutes if you want, or if you have other questions. Thank you.
I'm going to stay on because I have a question I didn't get to ask earlier when we were talking about disclosure. My husband is currently going through high-dose chemotherapy with a stem cell transplant, and I'm having quite an ethical dilemma in regard to how much to disclose to families. One, because I'm in quarantine almost all summer because I'm going back and forth from Maine to Boston, so I have to quarantine 14 days each time I come and go. So they're asking questions as far as like, can you help me with this? Can you help me with that? And I have to explain that I'm in quarantine without disclosing that my husband's sick. Secondly, his immune system has been wiped out, and he's that of a newborn baby, so the common cold could kill him. So for at least 3 to 6 months, I have to make sure that as we start opening back up right now, I'm working from home, so in telehealth, so it's easy. But as fall comes, if I'm being told I have to start seeing clients face to face, my employer has said, just disclose that you have an immune compromised family member. His stem cell transplant nurse is saying, no, you need to tell your families that you work with details so they understand how high of a risk it is. So that's where the ethical dilemma is like, how much do I disclose to explain to them, you have to wear a mask. You need to absolutely tell me when your child is sick, because last year I used the immune compromised family member when he was going through regular chemotherapy, and I would show up at people's houses and their kids would have the flu. And I'd have to turn around and say, sorry, I can't be here, and walk out. So I really have a dilemma on like, how much it does benefit me to disclose, and it benefits my husband, it's his life. So that's where it's like a huge ethical dilemma. How much do I disclose? Do you have any advice on what I should disclose? And
let me ask the group.
I think, if I may, I think that it is perfectly reasonable under those very specific circumstances to give people the information they need to behave responsibly and ethically. And if your husband's medical providers are telling you, this is the information families need to know in order to protect your husband, then I would give them that information.
Okay. My employer doesn't want me to. They're afraid, my employer is afraid that some of my families know that my husband has cancer, because when this first started, I did tell them. I have a lot of new families since then. And I have deleted my Facebook because I have families that lurk. And I have families that have discovered that my husband has had a third relapse because of Facebook and having mutual friends. Maine is a very small state. Everybody knows everybody. So I do disclose if they ask, but yeah, my employer is not wanting me to tell them anything except for I have an immune compromised family member. So it's very difficult for me, to the point where I thought about like leaving my job because his life is more important than my job. So
why does your employer say don't disclose? Who is the employer trying to protect?
They just don't want my families to. I work with children, and we do. It's definitely different, and I feel as a case manager in the children's world as much as it was when I was a case manager in the adult world. You definitely get a lot closer to moms. Well, I work mostly with the moms and the child, And my employer's worried that they have enough on their plate to worry about with their children, that they don't need to be worrying about their case manager also.
So you know the way I look at it a little bit. Oh, sorry, Emily. Can I just make one comment?
Yes.
Well, I wanted to make a comment. In addition to that one question, I'll keep mine really short, Kathy. Okay.
Yep. Sure.
All right. Okay. Maybe, you know, I mean, you can't pretend your husband isn't at risk, right? But maybe you could say that you have a family member and explain the seriousness of it the way his team wants you to, without saying, and it's my husband. I would think that when you're saying those things, your clients will see some emotion in you, and then that's something you and they will have to decide whether and how to address. But you can't pretend that that's not real, you know? Right. I mean, people have feelings. Social work therapists have feelings.
Right. And I was very discreet about it during flu season last year. Like I said, when he was just going through regular chemotherapy, where his immune system was compromised, but not to the level as it is now. As I said, like one little tiny bit of bacteria that we can fight off will kill him.